Welcome to the second installment of our Valley Talks series, virtual series. Thank you very much for attending. We have a large crowd this afternoon, and it would be great if you can take just a moment to write where you're from in the chat. So we like to keep up with where our visitors are from. So the museum remains closed at this time close to the public until we feel a little bit more comfortable with the statistics from COVID. But in the meantime, we are doing a lot virtually. We are giving tours to students, holding our virtual talk series, of course. And also we are in the midst of our annual appeal and raffle. And I see many familiar faces, and I know that many of you have already participated in our raffle, and I want to thank you. But if you have not and you'd like to support the museum, Sarah will be able to put the link to where you can give a donation. Small donations donations of all sizes are very much welcome, and that's the way we can continue to offer programs like this one, and also just sort of fill the gap from the lost income in admissions and store sales and rentals. So it would be great if you could help us out. So again, I want to thank you very much for being here this afternoon, and it's my pleasure right now to introduce you to the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historical Society, Dr. Morgan Greff.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, all of you, for being here today. It's great to see your smiling faces. Some of you haven't seen in over a year. I usually get to see you at the concerts, and it's so nice to see you here in my study. So welcome. It's my pleasure today to welcome Erik J. Chaput to our Valley Talks. Erik received his doctorate in early American history from Syracuse University. He is the author of The People's Martyr, Thomas Wilson Dorr, and his 1842 Rhode Island Rebellion. Professor Chaput teaches American history in the School of Continuing Education at Providence College and the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey. And that's my cat. Professor Chaput's research has appeared in numerous publications, including reviews in American history, Rhode Island history, our journal, the New England Quarterly, the U.S. Catholic Historian, the Catholic Historical Review, Historical New Hampshire, and the Historical Journal of Massachusetts. He is the co-editor with Russell D. Simone, who is with us today as well, of a digital edition of the Letters of Thomas Wilson Dorr. The letters are available on the Dorr Rebellion Project.
And it would seem that we lost Morgan. Apologies. I am going to spotlight Erik so he can begin his talk, however.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Hopefully we'll get Morgan back in just a second. I've been there many times on Zoom. I've disappeared. I do a lot of Zoom webinars at the Lawrenceville School, and technology can be a wonderful thing, but frustrating. But it's an absolute honor to be with you all this afternoon. And once again, thank you to Sarah and Morgan for affording me an opportunity to be with you here today on Zoom to talk about the Dorr Rebellion. We will, as Sarah mentioned, have the chat feature going towards the end. Happy to try to answer as many questions that I can. I do think there are some students on the call for some high schools in Rhode Island, or who will be watching the recording of it. So a lot of times there will be a lot of good conversation that will come out Q&A. So please feel free to type towards the end any questions. Since I know they're both on the call here, let me just thank and publicly my very good friend Rusty Simone, and one of my heroes, I believe Jane Lancaster, is on this call as well. And I will say that as for a young student at the time at Providence College, and then moving on to graduate school, I was indebted to the work of Russell D. Simone and Jane Lancaster. Really helped me to kind of get started on this journey. I lived with Thomas Wilson Dorr for a long time, but they were some of their works were really what helped to get me going. And I know Phoebe Bean can't be with us here today, but I want to just publicly acknowledge my debt to her and the incredible team at the Research Library. Spent many hours in that building and with the help of Phoebe and actually JDK as well to get through the dissertation and to write a book. Could not have done it without them. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some images that I'm going to put up and kind of move through in conjunction with my talk today. Hopefully it'll give you a little visual. So away we go. On April 8th, 1842, from their home on Benefit Street in Providence, Sullivan and Lydia Dorr penned a short and poignant letter to their oldest, most beloved son. Sullivan and Lydia were, as the surviving evidence suggests, loving and devoted parents. Through 4 decades of marriage, Sullivan and Lydia have been blessed with 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. Sullivan and Lydia Dorr likely thought of their older son as a man with a great future, though somehow behind him. Born into wealth and privilege, Thomas Wilson Dorr seemed as a young man destined to take his place among Rhode Island's upper echelon. He studied at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, a boarding school very similar to where I now live and work. This is an image of Dorr's father here. Actually, he looks a little bit like Rusty Simone on the call, but that's Sullivan. And that's his mother, Lydia. And this is from some of the curriculum guide at the time when Dorr was a student at Exeter. After Exeter, Dorr went on to Harvard, and then he went to Columbia Law. It seemed that he was destined to lead a life of genuine leisure and civic pursuits. He would certainly earn his place in the history books, though it was not quite in the way his father Sullivan and his mother Lydia had hoped. In the eyes of the Providence elite, 36-year-old Dorr was a sanctimonious, deluded demagogue hell-bent on destruction. Protestant clergymen at the First Baptist Church in Providence expressed a desire to see Dorr's head carried through the streets on a pole. Let me read you a little letter here to start off. This is from Dorr's parents. It grieves us to the heart to know that a son of ours, arrived at so mature an age and so well versed in the laws of his country, should be a participant in acts calculated to bring the state into destruction, arouse passions which you cannot allay, and which, God forbid, produce civil strife attended with bloodshed and murder. We beseech you, we pray you to pause before you pass the Rubicon and become engulfed in political criminal degradation, where our feeble prayers will not avail to save you from disgrace and ruin. Dorr's parents regarded him as a one-man bonfire of the vanities. Let me read you from a letter Dorr wrote to Newport attorney Judy Pierce on April 4th, 1842, after a huge rally was held in Providence in support of the People's Constitution and his candidacy for governor. A determined defense in return for the first blow is the purpose of the people. Woonsocket armed and equipped 200 men yesterday, Dorr wrote, 100 men today. 200 farmers were present at Lime Rock this afternoon, who proclaimed themselves ready to rescue any officer of the people. Warwick, ditto. North Providence organizes tomorrow. The Tories are alarmed, wrote Dorr, and they are stirring. The governor has issued an order to our companies here to make a return of their force. Their return is lean, said Dorr. Not more than 150 men of the military order can be found against us in the city. The bulk of the soldiers, Dorr said at the time, are for us. The arsenal is guarded only by 30 men. Though it is often forgotten, Thomas Dorr's ideology drew directly from Rhode Island's revolutionary legacy. When Rhode Island finally ratified the federal Constitution in May 1790, they sent back to Congress, then meeting in New York City, 18 amendments. The first line of the lengthy Third Amendment declared that the powers of the government may be resumed by the people whensoever it shall become necessary for their happiness. For Dorr, the 1776 Declaration of Independence was not merely designed to set forth a rhetorical enumeration of lofty goals. Instead, in Dorr's mind, the document enshrined the absolute supremacy of the people over their political institutions. It was the primary doctrine, Dorr wrote, of our democratic republic. In this analysis, Jefferson's Declaration was not simply a philosophical statement, but a political and constitutional document. So why Rhode Island? Why 1841 into 1842? And why Thomas Wilson Dorr? The origins of what has become known as Dorr's Rebellion lay deep in the state's history. As late as 1842, Rhode Island was still operating under a charter granted by King Charles II of England. Following the restoration of the Stuart line in 1660, there was some doubt that the patent of 1643, under which the Rhode Island colony had been governed, was still valid. The colony dispatched John Clark of Newport and Roger Williams of Providence to England to petition the British monarch for a new instrument of government. On July 8, 1663, the colony was granted a new charter. Under the charter, the apportionment was fixed at 6 representatives for the town of Newport, 4 each for the towns of Portsmouth, Providence, and Warwick. All new towns were to have representatives. For more than 100 years, the charter worked fairly well for the colony. At the end of the American Revolution, when all the other colonies shed their colonial status and framed constitutions, Rhode Island merely modified the charter by replacing reference to the British Crown with references to the General Assembly. The charter restricted suffrage to those men possessing real estate, that is property. That figure was set in the year 1798 at $134, thereby disenfranchising most of the population from the commercial and manufacturing districts as you get into the 19th century. The election of 1840, as many historians have talked about when they cover the political history of the antebellum period, was indeed a turning point. Huge rallies were connected with this election. The rise of a stable two-party system in the Jacksonian period led to the increased efforts by political parties to seek out groups of people that had previously been locked out of the political process. Workers, laborers, abolitionists, women's rights advocates began to use the Declaration of Independence in this period to justify their quest for equality and their belief that they deserved, certainly in the case of Rhode Island reformers, the right to vote. Thomas Dorr believed that citizenship was not a privilege to be enjoyed only by those with landed wealth, but a right of every adult male vested in his person rather than in his property. In 1841, as winter turned to spring, the Rhode Island Suffragettes Association began to demonstrate loudly for their cause. In the spring and summer of 1841, there were mass meetings held in Providence and Newport with turnouts estimated between 3,000 and 5,000 people at each event. Former Governor William Gibbs of Newport likened the activities of a suffrage association and their penchant for majority rule with the rule of a mob. Each side in Rhode Island began to see the other's position as an abomination. Suffragists that Dorr became connected to accused the charter government supporters of perpetuating, ancient inequities out of a selfish lust for power. Charter supporters claimed that suffragists were enemies of stability, using reform as a mask of revolution. As to why Thomas Dorr emerged as the intellectual spokesman of the common man, he was the preeminent reformer of his era in the state of Rhode Island. In the economic realm, he drafted a major piece of legislation that provided for government regulation of state-chartered banks. He worked for the abolition of imprisonment of debt. He was an ardent abolitionist and anti-slavery advocate, serving on the executive committee of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society. He was also a leading educational reformer, pioneering the construction of the state's first high school. By the end of 1841, Dorr had become the leading figure within the Rhode Island Suffrage Association. And on screen here are several ribbons from the collection of Russell D. Simone that were worn at some of these rallies. This one is from May of 41 on your screen.
That's shade down.
There's July of 1841. This actually is my personal favorite, that one. And here's another one backing up just slightly. This is April from 1841. Over a 3-day period in the month of December 1841, an overwhelming majority of Rhode Islanders, almost 14,000 in favor with just 52 opposed, cast ballots for the People's Constitution. Referring to the Suffrage Association and its intellectual spokesman, Providence attorney Thomas Wilson Dorr wrote Elijah Potter, Jr., a lawyer from South Kingstown, this is an image of Martyr, declared that those who have raised the storm may not be able to govern it or control it. Martyr proclaimed his affinity for what he called the old system under the charter that granted a disproportionate amount of power to the agrarian areas of the state of Rhode Island. But he recognized the democratic tide that was sweeping the state could not be turned back. It's probably settled that we must have free suffrage, but in what way should it be brought about, asked Martyr. For Martyr and former Governor John Brown Francis, in order for constitutional change to be legal, it had to come from the sitting General Assembly and not an extra legal convention that Dorr had been a part of. As you get into the spring of 1842, there were two governments in Rhode Island, one claiming legitimacy under a colonial charter that prescribed no mode for amendment, the other claiming legitimacy from a constitution adopted by the majority of citizens in an extra legal plebiscite. Thomas Dorr was elected the people's governor under the People's Constitution on April 18th, 1842. On April 20th, Samuel Ward King was elected to his fourth term in office under the old system of the charter. Here is an image of King. And for those of you who are fans of the Rolling Stones band, I always thought that King looked a little bit like Keith Richards. And to drive that image home in your head, here is, for those of you who know the humor of JDK at the Rhode Island Historical Society, that's his talent with marking an image up. But once again, this is Samuel Ward King, now in his fourth term as governor. In writing my book on Dorr, I was struck by how true each side was to the core values it claimed to be fighting for. It was the coercive power of recalcitrant state legislature against the potency of the revolutionary doctrine of popular sovereignty. History seldom provides pure embodiments of such contrasting political alternatives. But in the spring of 1842, they were both on display, and the military projections of both perspectives were committed to a collision course. The Dorrites labeled their opponents Tories, an attempt to brand their protagonists as somehow un-American and hostile to the principles of the American Revolution. For their part, Dorr's opponents aptly named themselves the Law and Order Party, because they just sincerely believed that the Dorrites were bent on destroying Republican government as they understood it. Rhode Island conservatives believed that the enthusiasm for democratic change that was a hallmark of the Jacksonian period had simply gone to the heads of so many citizens. In their analysis, Rhode Island laborers and mechanics that had been on the outside looking in for decades in terms of civic life had let the talk of freedom and equality consume them. Many Rhode Island elites were uneasy with the notion that the people needed to play an ongoing oversight role in government. They believed that the people were only sovereign on election days. This was a view shared by many Federalists from the early national period. When reading the letters from this period, along with many of Dorr's opponents, you really get a sense that they felt as if they were standing in the center of a windstorm as the currents of history swept past them. When Sullivan and Lydia were writing to their son on April 8th, 1842, the letter that I read to you just a moment ago, representatives from what was known as the charter government were in Washington lobbying President John Tyler, it's an image of Tyler there, to send troops to Rhode Island to help round up what Moses Brown Ives called desperados. On a side note, Moses was actually married to Dorr's sister, Annie. Dorr's sister, Mary, was married to a man named Samuel Ames. He happened to be the state's quartermaster general and would indeed be tasked with trying to capture his brother-in-law. Ives was hopeful that the passage of a draconian statute a few days before, in early April, which labeled all those who supported the People's Constitution traitors to the state, would deter Dorr, who they believed was absolutely committed to implementing the People's Constitution. There would be no formal declaration from Washington against the People's Constitution, much to the conservatives' lament. And indeed, Thomas Dorr pushed forward. His inaugural parade brought out thousands of supporters onto the streets of Providence on May 3rd, 1842. After an attempt to elicit support from President Tyler for his cause had failed, Dorr decided to take matters into his own hands. Tyler dovetailed, I should point out, between both the Whigs and the Democrats in this period. They both tried to woo him in this situation in Rhode Island. There actually is a very good new biography of John Tyler that was just published a few months ago by a man named Christopher Leahy, that teaches in one of the SUNY schools in New York State. Dorr's uncle, Philip Allen, a future governor and employer of a sizable number of Irish workers, attempted to broker a compromise with Dorr. But as it was later pointed out by Moses Brown Eyes, Dorr paid no attention. Dorr let it be known that he had lost all patience with moderates who were hoping for reconciliation. Now, as you get into May, or middle of May, there was a quasi-army of somewhat marginal misfits led by an overconfident military amateur was marching to take over an arsenal on the west side of Providence. As dusk turned to dark on May 17, 1842, the residents of Providence, Rhode Island were returning to their homes, but a few were preparing for a restful night's sleep. Citizens were on edge, expecting the sound of cannon fire at any moment. Shops and banks had been closed all day. The city's cobblestone streets were filled with men in uniform, from young recruits engaged in their first military drills to more senior militiamen who might have performed a similar duty a decade earlier when the city was beset by a multi-day race riot that left 4 dead. At first, it was mere rumor and speculation, but as the night wore on, credible witnesses reported that the people's governor was planning an assault on the arsenal. If this was to be his final battle, Dorr intended to go out like a cannonade. The moment reached a crescendo in the early morning hours of May 18th. Commentators frequently referred to the state of civil commotion. Now, the commotion looked like all-out war, as Dorr and his band of devoted followers threatened violence and conflagration. Providence militiaman William Bailey, whose papers are at the Rhode Island Historical Society, was convinced that Dorr was motivated only by malice and revenge. Dorr's goal, according to Bailey, was to destroy lives and property. Not taking any chances, Bailey hired a carriage to take his wife and his young son out of the city. Whigs in Providence wrote frequently to Senator James Simmons. Is an image of conservative image of painted by Dorr as a chunky Napoleon with a butter knife up high. Image of the arsenal here. And here's an image of Simmons. Whigs in Providence wrote frequently to him to remind him of Dorr's service on the executive committee of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society and his membership in the American Anti-Slavery Society. What Whigs in Providence wanted to do was to kind of steer up, eliciting the help of Senator James Simmons, attacks on Dorr from Southern Democrats who would be afraid of Dorr's ideology spreading into the South that could incite a possible slave rebellion. Let me read you from a letter. Mr. Dorr, if he fails in Rhode Island, we'll try the experiment over again in South Carolina, where the majority of the physical people would probably be much larger than it is here. Mr. Dorr surely could not object that slaves were not people, human beings. It is well known here that his abolition feelings have within a year or two past been quite as strong as his feelings for free suffrage. I urge you to remember that this man, Thomas Wilson Dorr, who is now controlling the spring of Rhode Island insurrection and the governor-elect under the People's Constitution so-called, was in the year 1839, only 3 years ago, one of the executives of the State Committee of the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society. The senators formed from the slave states should understand who it is that made the insurrection against our government here. This was indeed, as I talk about in my book, a very effective effort by Whigs in Providence to round up support nationally against Dorr within the southern branches of the Democratic Party. Southerners were indeed watching events in Rhode Island with a very close eye. It actually shows up remarkably in Southern newspapers that I once again chronicle in the book. At 2 o'clock in the morning on May 18th, alarm bells and this cry of fire began to arouse Providence's sleeping inhabitants. Church bells began their successive stroke at short intervals in order to arouse the sleeping inhabitants. The steeple stops of numerous churches thundered to life. Perhaps Dorr recognized the sound, I always wondered, of the bells atop St. John's Episcopal Church, where his family owned a pew. After the bell sounded, a young and frightened Danforth Hodges heard a cannon signaling that the free suffrage men were attacking the arsenal. The cannon shot young Hodges heard was not actually aimed at the arsenal. It was a signal from Dorr's headquarters for his men to assemble on a hilltop a mile west. Reports put Dorr's forces anywhere between 300 and 400. With street lamps veiled by heavy fog rising from Narragansett Bay, Dorr's men used torches to light their way to the arsenal. Providence elites living in large homes on the hills of the east side of the city saw a long column of flickering lights marching off into the darkness. Lydia Dorr likely watched with trepidation as her husband went off to defend the city and her son Sullivan Jr. went to join her brothers in the arsenal. Lydia's family was coming apart at the seams and bringing the city with it. 70 of Dorr's men had successfully stolen two 60-pound cannons in broad daylight from the United Train of Artillery in Providence the day before. Now he seemed committed to try to use them. If Dorr's men had dragged the cannon directly to the arsenal, they probably could have taken it without firing a shot. The arsenal, a 50 by 60-foot structure with chipped stone walls, was constructed to withstand shot and shell, but its thatched roof could easily be blown off or worse, ignited, perhaps engulfing those inside. Governor King called for additional reinforcements from conservative coastal enclaves of Warren, Bristol, and Newport, all former centers of the lucrative slave trade. King went to the arsenal to encourage his men to stand their ground. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the morning, Dorr's men had set up an encampment within musket shot of the northwest wall of the building. A young Anna Herreshoff noted to her father Charles that all Dorr's relatives were in the arsenal that dreadful night when the demon, how she referred to Dorr, with his own hand put the match to the cannon. He might have destroyed his own father. Anna went on to write that Dorr's men were not simply trying to gain suffrage. They were looking for a division of property. With his reduced numbers, Dorr deemed it expedient to fire in the arsenal with cannon shot before ordering his men to storm the position. The plan was sound, except for one important detail. His men had failed to properly cover the cannon. When it started to rain, the damp wicks would not light. When the cannons failed to ignite, Dorr's men fled into the night. The people's governor soon followed. His uncle helped him actually escape the city. Here's a headline from the New York Herald. Killed 0, wounded 0, missing 481, scared 960, horribly frightened 789, fainted on the battleground 73, women in hysterics 22, temperance pledge broken before the battle begun 330, the governor's missing 1. Well, the seriousness of the issue, though. In June, Dorr would come back. We often look at this affair as somewhat of a comic opera as it is painted. I'll go back to a popular image that ran depicting Dorr as a kind of a bumbling buffoon. But for those living through this period in the spring of 1842, this was indeed deadly serious, as so many of the letter collections that I looked at the Rhode Island Historical Society pointed out. Martial law would remain in place. Many of Dorr's followers were rounded up and thrown in jail, wallowing in prison. After this all came to an end in June up in Chaput, many more went to jail. What a horrible state of things exists in Rhode Island. What calamity can be more unendurable to a free people than to be placed under the absolute despotism of martial law, wrote William Lloyd Garrison to his brother-in-law, George Benson, in Rhode Island on July 7th, 1842. With the suffrage party, I have very little sympathy because while they protest against a land-holding aristocracy, they basically excluded by their own constitution all colored citizens from voting at the polls. But I have still less sympathy for the Charter Party, wrote Garrison. Dorr would flee the state, hiding out in New Hampshire, first in a town called Westmoreland, then on to Concord. He actually lived openly with the governor, Democratic governor of New Hampshire, a man named Henry Hubbard, for many months. He walked the streets of Concord with a friend named Franklin Pierce, a name you might have heard of before. He would return to the state in 1843. On Halloween, actually, 1843, he'd be jailed in Newport. His trial would commence in 1844. He would indeed be the first man to be convicted of treason against the state. The second would be John Brown, who was convicted of treason against the state of Virginia in 1859 and then executed. Of course, Dorr was not executed. His time in prison would become a rallying cry during the election of 1844, and that's an image of Dorr in the center holding up his chains. It was an effective position for the Democrats to take against their Whig opponents. He was known in prison, and this is actually from the John Hay Library, as prison number 56. And what did he do during his time in prison? Once again, he was lucky to escape execution. He painted lovely hand fans. By his own record, several thousand of them in his time in prison. This is one that's been exquisitely preserved by the Rhode Island School of Design. We have some images on the on the Providence College Dorr Rebellion website that you can find. But this is the work that he did. For those interested in the Gordon murder, Dorr is quite a moving letter that we have on the website that he actually could hear Gordon being going off to hang in the yard of the prison. He wrote this letter to his mother, and we've recently put up all the letters that Dorr wrote to his mother from prison that are quite moving. I encourage you to take a look at the website. You will find the whole collection of Dorr's prison correspondence to his mother. And in one of those letters, he does indeed talk about the Gordon murder trial and listening to that execution on the rope. So things I like to talk about with my students. The story of the Dorr Rebellion, I think, represents a constitutional question of a great moment for Americans before the Civil War. The question was simple: who were the rightful monitors of the constitutional order? Today, many take it for granted that that function falls to the Supreme Court, but that generation was far from clear for Americans of an earlier generation. For then it seemed quite plausible that the court, Congress, and the executive each had roles to play, and what their interrelationship was remained uncertain. And of course, even more outside of our modern understanding and yet clearly compelling to many Americans was the possibility that the role of the people, however one conceived them, as a check on unconstitutional actions of government. In the Dorr Rebellion, you see a legacy of the American Revolution playing out again decades later in the antebellum period. There are hot button issues here in the rebellion of democracy, of race, of gender, of nativism. They are all contained, and with the work and the help of my good friend Rusty Simone, we have tried to put that onto the Dorr Rebellion Project website for teachers to engage with. Nativist Whigs, led by the Providence Journal editor Henry Bowen Anthony, feared the growing number of Irish Catholic laborers who tended to align themselves with the Democratic Party. Rhode Island Catholics actually stayed away from the rebellion by order of the priest in Providence for fear of arrest. But Dorr's efforts would have tended to bolster their political power in the state. Women were very connected to Thomas Wilson Dorr. And there is another collection on the Dorr Rebellion Project website I encourage you to look at that highlights this profound role of women in the rebellion. Dorr kept up correspondence with women throughout his life, most notably Providence author Catherine R. Williams. But they played a significant role in the wake of the rebellion to keep Dorr's cause alive as men were in prison. Women ran in clam bakes to raise money. They gave speeches, and indeed they led the effort to get Dorr out of prison, and he would be released in 1845. He would spend the rest of his life at his home on the east side of Providence, where he grew up, and that's indeed where he would die in his bedroom in 1854. As I highlight in my book, this was no tempest in a teapot, as a phrase actually coined by Catherine R. Williams. The president was involved, that is John Tyler. There was a large congressional committee in 1844 producing a 1,000-page report led by New Hampshire Congressman Edwin Burke. There was also a minority report produced by Southern Democrats against Dorr's position known as the Cousin Report. There was a Supreme Court case that decided the question of what is known as the Guarantee Clause in Article 4 of the Constitution. So there is without question an awful lot to unpack with students in this event. And once again, along with my good friend Russell D. Simone, we try to help teachers do that in the classroom through the Dorr Rebellion Project website that the Rhode Island Historical Society has very graciously helped us out from the beginning. They were behind us 10 years ago when we got it started. And it's been a pleasure to continue to work with them to make sure that this story, this remarkable story, can be brought forth to a new generation of Rhode Islanders to learn about in the classroom, and for teachers to have an easier job of bringing it into the classroom. So I know I've talked for a little bit longer than I had intended. I want to make sure we have a lot of time for Q&A. I'm going to stop my screen share here. And I know we have some experts on Rhode Island history on the call today, but I want to make sure that we can get to some questions. So the chat room is open, and I'm happy to read those. I think Sarah has access as well, that she can look at those. But let me just say thank you again for having me. It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning, and hopefully in the next 20 minutes or so we can learn a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Erik. So we do already have a couple questions that have been sent to me in the chat. The first is, how does the Dorr Rebellion compare with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts?
Oh, it's a great question. Thank you. Yes, that comes up quite a bit actually when you read newspaper accounts. And as I said, it is like a replay of the American Revolutionary period over again. So in terms of what Dorr was doing, you can argue obviously intending to go further than Daniel Shays had done, but there's a lot of parallels. Obviously, you're involving questions of attack on an arsenal and arming citizens who were upset, in this case, obviously in 1786 in Massachusetts, over what was happening in the state and the power structure that they believed that they were being kind of carved out of. And there was certainly a question of taxation that was happening, and farms that were being foreclosed on in Massachusetts in the aftermath of the American Revolution that Daniel Shays became that spokesperson for. Certainly Dorr, different than Shays in terms of his background, highly educated, once again, goes to Phillips Exeter Academy, similar to the boarding school where I'm talking to you from here at Lawrenceville in New Jersey. Exeter actually opened its doors. It's one of the oldest boarding schools in the country, opened its doors in 1795. Dorr would go from there once again to Harvard as a teenager. He would be involved actually in a little mini insurrection in 1823 in Harvard that came back to haunt him slightly during the rebellion. That came up in the newspaper accounts again, Dorr's time at Harvard. He would go on from there to study law under Chancellor James Kent down in New York, essentially at Columbia Law School. So his educational background different than Shays, but a bold plan once again involving a military component in action to take an arsenal, belief in the capacity of the citizens themselves to enact change. For those that, and obviously at the time in Massachusetts and then later in Rhode Island, there were those on the opposing side who said this is not the way that you can enact change. There's a sitting government, there's a process, that this type of behavior or actions is not part of Republican government. But both events from 1786 to 1841 and to 1842 in Rhode Island, you see this replay of what did the American Revolution itself actually mean? And without question, you do see Shays' Rebellion referenced a lot in newspaper accounts on both sides in 1841, 1842.
Great. Our next question is, what radicalized Dorr?
Oh, another good question. Thank you. I think this is one that I will say, and I know Russ and Jane are on the call here. I think it's important to point out that Dorr had a long history of being a reformer prior to getting involved with the Rhode Island Suffragettes Association in 1841. He didn't start the Suffrage Association. Sometimes he gets falsely painted that Dorr led this movement from the very beginning. He did not. He actually came in kind of late to it in many ways. They were happy to have someone of his stature come in. He started his career as a Whig, and then he would change his political affiliation as you get into the end of 39 into 1840 to go over to the Democrats. I think he certainly was consumed by a northern branch of what was known as the Democracy. That's how they referred to Jackson's party, and their penchant for kind of increasing the scope and power and the role of the people. That rhetoric, I think, really pushed him. But prior to all of this, he was involved in anti-slavery and banking reform. He really wanted to make society better. And his profound efforts in anti-slavery, I think, are often were overlooked. I tried to get that into my book as much as I could. He was he really thought very deeply of what we would call kind of anti-slavery constitutionalism. He's a kind of forgotten figure in regards to abolition. But in the 1830s, Dorr really laid out a plan of what was possible under the Constitution for anti-slavery. I will say this: is anti-slavery constitutionalism is come back in vogue amongst historians. James Oakes, who teaches at the SUNY Graduate School in New York, has written a kind of a brilliant new book about Lincoln and anti-slavery constitutionalism. But he drops back to the 1830s, and of course Lincoln was a Whig, and he goes through where this comes from. He calls it the anti-slavery project, and I think Dorr was very much part of this anti-slavery project, if you will, in the 1830s. So he had a long history as a reformer. Educational reform was something that he was very devoted to, especially in the city of Providence. And another thing that is remarkable about Dorr in terms of issues of race is that it is not uncommon to read any letter collection, as sizable as certainly Dorr's is, to find elements of racism expressed by, white 19th century males. What's remarkable about the size of the Dorr collection, most of it at the John Hay Library in Providence, is that you don't see that. Now, something changes in Dorr, and I'm happy to talk about that later in life. At the end of the 1840s, there is a change, but early on, the absence is actually striking. So he was very open, and he himself had worked very hard to include African Americans into the People's Constitution. He wanted them to have the right to vote. They had been disenfranchised in Rhode Island in 1823. And Dorr wanted to bring them back in. But he was outvoted at the People's Constitution. He later received a lot of criticism in the abolitionist press, actually principally by Garrison, that Dorr was very hurt by. And he never actually forgave Garrison. And I think that played a role in where he ended up later in life. And in terms of gender, once again, very open for issues of gender equality and working with female reformers at a much higher level than you would see most 19th century white males do. So I think it was a process he went through, but you can find the seeds of it early through his, first-class education, but also I think in the fact that he got involved in so many reform efforts in the 1830s that free suffrage was kind of a logical extension. Took it farther than he certainly did with those other reform efforts, but I think it grew out of that.
Great. Our next question is, in addition to the RAHS records and your valuable website, is there a physical space that celebrates Dorr, the Gloucester Historical Society, perhaps?
Certainly, and I've been up there before. They do wonderful work. I've given a couple of talks up there. I will say, in terms of a physical space, in addition to Rusty Simone's living room, which he does and has invited students into his house many times. He has a wonderful collection. It is very, very generous to let people see it. I will say the John Hay Library on Prospect Street. I don't know if Holly Schneider is on this call, but they have a massive collection. And I lived at that building. I felt like I actually was a student at Brown for years. And all of the vast majority of Dorr's papers are there. And it took me close to 3 years to go through them all. And I still feel that I didn't touch everything that I could go back. But that is a wonderful physical space to be in the Hay, to kind of get immersed in these papers that are beautifully preserved. And Holly is such a wonderful guide through this massive, absolutely massive collection.
Could you say a bit more about the role of women throughout the rebellion?
Thank you. Yes, no, that was something that Russell and I have been thinking about for a long time, is to make sure that that story get onto this website. And so thankfully recently we've been able to do that, putting up over 20 letters. There's many more, but we wanted to really bring this story alive. Jane Lancaster has written about this. Ron Formasano has a wonderful article from about 1992 or 93 in the Rhode Island Historical Society Journal. I believe you can access online fairly easily in the PDF file. But these women really came alive, I will say, in June of 1842, when men were either in prison, and there were many that were sent to prison. We have a wonderful record and collection of this, of the prisoners, and the documentation that went along with hearings. But women really kept the cause alive. They traveled back and forth from Rhode Island to New Hampshire to meet with Dorr, to inform them constantly of all the efforts of the clam bakes that they were running in southeastern Mass. They typically ran them outside of Rhode Island for safety for themselves and anyone who journeyed. But they really got involved also in helping to elect a Democratic governor in Massachusetts, a man named Marcus Morton, who benefited from the politics of the rebellion in his state. The Democrats in Massachusetts charged the sitting Whig governor of aiding, and indeed he did. He did actually send weapons down that were not used to Providence. But it helped Morton win, and the women played a tremendous role. They created a platform in southeastern Massachusetts for the Democratic candidate, once again, Marcus Morton from Taunton, to really use the politics of the rebellion for his own purposes, and he would win that governorship in 1842 and serve a couple of terms in office. And women, once again, when Dorr, after he's convicted of his trial and sent to prison, they led this, what was known as the Dorr Liberation Society. They raised money. They were extraordinarily active in keeping Dorr's name out there. This played a role, I think, in the election of 1844. Dorr's name, actually in the North, when you look at newspaper coverage of that election, it was Polk, Dallas, that's the vice presidential candidate, and Dorr. So Dorr was essentially almost on the ticket in that election, and Polk, of course, would win. It was a very close election. He would beat Henry Clay, razor thin margin, and I think the politics of the Dorr Rebellion did help. And at that stage, women were more active than men, actually, at that point, in kind of keeping it alive.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, can you tell us about the Dorr Rebellion in Burrillville?
I will defer towards the end, and I will make sure I unmute Rusty Simone and help me out with that. I have a couple of names that come to mind, but I'm going to check with Russ before I go off script, before I get them wrong. But there were in that part of the state, Dorr did enjoy support, including also in Woonsocket. There was a reason Dorr drifted northward in June of 42, but that strength of sentiment had been in starting in kind of March and April and May. But I'll bring Russ on. I will make sure we unmute him in just a moment. But it's a good question.
Okay.
But it was without, there was a Dorr, high level of Dorr support there for sure.
Okay, excellent. So it looks like you've answered most of the questions that came after that. We do have a question that is, I have a newspaper page, an evening daily transcript that has an article on the Dorr Rebellion. Where would be the best place to donate it?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I would be happy, as I said, to kind of try to scan it into or take, a quality JPEG image that you might have and get it onto the Dorr Rebellion Project website. In terms of donation, I would try to contact, for the actual item itself, certainly the Rhode Island Historical Society or the John Hay Library for sure. But we would love to maybe put it onto the website with the owner's permission, of a quality JPEG or a scan of it, and have it once again be part of what we have there for students and teachers.
Great, excellent. I'll also quickly say if anyone is looking to reach out after the talk, we will be emailing everyone a copy of this recording as well as a further reading list. And if you need for any reason to follow up, you can certainly respond to that email and I'll be happy to pass along any communication.
And I am happy to stay on for a few minutes. I know people might have to drift off, I think at the Zoom. I teach on Zoom all the time, so the attention span of my students usually kind of wanes after about the 50-minute mark. But I'm happy to stay on here for a few minutes if others want to drop off the call, and we can create a kind of a smaller group. It'd be certainly a pleasure for a few minutes to to be with you, maybe a little bit more of a one-on-one type of a feeling. So I will definitely do that.
Certainly. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to just ask one final question, which had been sent ahead of time. So Eric, you have seen this, which was the question about Dorr's personal friends, particularly Edward Peckham. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Peckham, it's a great question, and I really benefited that he has a diary. So he was an artist in Providence, very interesting, and I talk a lot about him in my book. The diary is quite remarkable. He did join a militia in Providence. Evidence suggests that he knew Dorr growing up. He was an artist, but his diary of essentially May, maybe into July of 42, but certainly May and June of 42 is at the John Hay Library. And it was a wonderful, wonderful, primary source for me to kind of get at. I think once again, what I tried to do in this book was to certainly have Dorr come alive through his letters. And we have copies of both his outgoing letters, I should point out, and incoming, because he kept copies. And I did my best to try to track where I could if there were changes from a draft outgoing letter to the final product. So I traveled quite a bit around the Northeast to look at other collections to see if they matched up. But Peckham's diary, and along with, I would say, about a half a dozen other collections at the Rhode Island Historical Society, including William Bailey's papers, really helped to make this story come alive, because I was able to kind of read what the average person in Providence at the time thought, instead of just national or like newspaper coverage of the event. And once again, it often gets portrayed as kind of a comic opera, and there's just reason for that, for sure. But for those, once again, participants at the time, this was deadly serious. It's a deadly serious question about democracy that almost turned horribly violent at the time. Dorr's own younger father and brother were in the arsenal. Always been a bit of a debate. Did he know that? Was he aware of that? Did he intend to shoot these cannons or not? There's some historical debate about, was it the rain? Could someone have plugged the cannons before? There seems to be some evidence of tampering, possibly, to try to stop Dorr, but it went pretty far. So was going to try to stop him, you think they would have stopped him before he dragged the cannons all the way over there. So if that was the case, that tampering was done at the very last possible moment before lives could have been lost. Thankfully, none were at the arsenal. And in June, his forces pretty much just immediately ran away once they saw the sizable team that was essentially coming up Route 44 through Greenville. Rusty Simone owns a couple of fascinating letters for residents of Greenville describing this moving up. And indeed, African Americans in Providence were at the forefront of the line. They had been shut out by Dorr. They had in turn turned their lot into the charter forces. And indeed, in the wake of the rebellion, African Americans received the right to vote in a plebiscite in Rhode Island. And that was significant. But they had desperately felt that they had an ally in Dorr and others in the People's Convention, and they were sadly shut out. So the politics of race in the story of the rebellion is interesting. And as I said, you also have this politics in the South where it was Dorr had, of course, no intention of inciting a slave revolt, but his revolutionary rhetoric frightened Southerners, and skillful politicians in the North knew that it would, and they played that up quite dramatically and quite skillfully and ultimately effectively.
Great. We don't have any new questions in the chat, but is there anyone that you would like me to co-spotlight with you and unmute?
I think, Sarah, if you could unmute Russ so that I can see him in the top left of my screen, and just so we can maybe get a better response than I gave on the question of Burrowville. You know, a very good question. I think we should try to get at that.
Okay, am I being heard?
Yeah.
Well, Burrowville's a little off the beaten path for the Dorr Rebellion. The epicenter of events pertaining to the rebellion, kind of Chaput, which is in Gloucester, and in Slatersville. And if you draw a line through the state, horizontal line, and everything north of Providence, pretty much everybody's a pro-Dorr, a Dorrite, okay, free suffrage. And everything south of that is pretty much law and order. So if you look at the people that were involved actually at Smithfield, and back in 1842, Smithfield's this humongous tract of land, including places like Lincoln and North Smithfield today is all one. And Dr. Marcus Martin, who lived not too far from Burrowville, was a leader in the suffrage movement. Also, if you go into Chaput, Amasa Eddy, Samuel Atwell, who would be a defense lawyer for Thomas Dorr. If you look online, Dr. Clifford Brown, who he teaches up at Union College in New York State, he has a website for the Free Will Baptist Church in Chaput, and it's specifically pertaining to the Dorr Rebellion. It's a wonderful, wonderful website. You know, we're partial to the Providence College website because it contains so much, including lesson plans. But the story that Cliff Brown tells, so Dr. Brown tells, is a wonderful resource to go to. Also, militia companies were formed from all of these towns in support of Dorr. Okay, and usually they don't have the name of the town, but they may have the name of the village. So maybe coming out of Pasco, part of Burrowville, and the like. But there were prisoners that were captured after Chaput. Okay, there was 260 approximately prisoners captured, and some were from Burrowville. I can come up with those names. I don't have them off the top of my head. Certainly not all 260. But they were captured, fleeing, as did Dorr. You know, there's an old poem, he came, he saw, he scampered, or the hill of two flights. These are anti-Dorr poems. But as people went out of the state, okay, the name of the game was to leave Rhode Island or be arrested. And I would say as many as 250 men left the state and lived in exile. And they lived just over the border, mainly in Bellingham and in other towns like Medway, up in that area, Millville. And some of those men were Burrowville, they're farmers basically, but they had to leave because they were pro-Dorr, and under the Algerine law of that Erik referred to that came out in April, he was subject to be arrested for treason, for even voting in the People's Constitution. Okay, and we know that 13,000 people voted for that Constitution. So without having specific names, but militia companies coming out of the village of Pasco and elsewhere, and let's face it, you know, I live down in Middletown, so my idea of Burrowville is about as far away as you can get and still be in Rhode Island. But we're all Dorrites in Burrowville. There were no really law and order men.
Well, thank you, Russ. I hope that that gets at the attendees to question. It was much better than I could have done. So Russ, thank you. Thank you for chiming in there. And once again, it's been a pleasure to be with you here today. And I will stay on the call for a few more minutes. You know, if people want to drop off or stay, I'll just stay put. I have to take my kids out in a little bit outside, but I have a few minutes. I'm not due back home until 2:30, so I'm okay.
Hi.
You have another question. We do have another question. So
Sure.
I have a question.
Can you pause one moment and I'll unmute you when it's time? So we have a question here in the chat asking, can you speak more about the Law and Order Party? Is this some of the earliest usage of law and order rhetoric in America, or was this already widely used?
Great question. Obviously, yes. If you know the history of American, broadly American political history, you hear that phrase a lot. Right? Law and order. Certainly, I actually had a number of students back this past spring who were writing papers about Nixon, 1968. To my understanding, in terms of the terminology that connected actually to a self-identified party in Rhode Island, and just not political rhetoric in a newspaper, but using it as key members and some former governors, that this was kind of the first moment at that point that it had the phrase been used before, of course, but in Rhode Island, it gets very strongly connected beyond rhetoric in a newspaper to an actual party. Now that party itself was made up of Whigs and also Democrats, not the variety of Thomas Dorr, but more Democrats in the southern portion of the state. And even within, I will say, this kind of law and order party in Rhode Island, you're looking at it in 1842, and it does live on after this. There's varying degrees within it that are important. Russ and I did a project on former Governor John Brown Francis at this point in the rebellion. And there were many who felt that it could have been handled better. Many conservatives felt that it could have been handled better. That tensions needed to be kind of calmed down, and some conservatives were responsible for revving it up. I would put John Brown Francis kind of in the middle, along with Elijah Potter. I think the two of them tried to, in their own way, bring perhaps people to the table. They certainly were not rabid conservatives. So within the law and order coalition, if you will, there are also degrees. And of course, we live in the age, lived through the age of Trump recently. It came back, was part of the age of Trump in that phrase. And so it pops up throughout, various flashpoints in American history. Interesting though, once again, in Rhode Island, it goes beyond rhetoric to actually the formation of a party that brings in two opposing groups, Whigs and Democrats, who politically would be duking it out, but they found common ground in their opposition to Thomas Dorr to form, in their sense, a successful party that put down, Dorr's forces.
Okay, great. Sarah Gleason had a question. Sarah, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I wrote in chat, what was Dorr's relations with his family in the last 9 years of his life living at home? Do you know about that?
Thank you, Sarah. Oh, there you are. I can see you now. Well, yes, you're right. He did live at home. He died at home. I've through the kindness of Frank Moran, who owns the house, descendant from the Samuel Ames line. Mr. Moran let me in several times to the home to look at some letters that he had. That actually shed remarkable light for me on Dorr's. A good question a few minutes ago about kind of Dorr's early activism. He was connected to some English reformers, and Mr. Moran had some letters that shed a remarkable light on that. And he let me in, and I got the chance to see the home, and indeed, that's where he died in a small bedroom. We don't know is the short answer. So as I mentioned, his letter collection at the John Hay is massive collection. I don't have evidence for this, but I think Russ DeSimone shares my belief that Dorr likely got rid of letters, some family letters. So you do see them early on in the collection, period that covers his early life. You see that remarkable letter from his parents that I read to you in the very beginning part of today, telling him to stand down, please stand down, don't do this, April 1842. But there's not a lot in there from his siblings. He had some siblings that also attended Phillips Exeter Academy, Henry. It was Sullivan Jr. They show up early, but not later. Very limited on his relationship with his sisters. Of course, several of them were married to men who were whose job was to track him down and potentially kill him and capture him, if not, capture him. So, but we don't have. I always wondered what a kind of a crazy Thanksgiving dinner this would have been. Record of how that relationship went. He was very close with his mother. That has been preserved. We have that. And you can see that on the Dorr Rebellion Project website. These were little scraps of paper because Dorr was not allowed to actually, he wasn't supposed to have a lamp or a pen and paper. These things were smuggled into him, and he wrote these messages to his mother. Most likely who was getting them out was Catherine Williams, was kind of the intermediary between getting these notes out of prison into Lydia's hand and then bringing them back again. And so they've been preserved, and it shows us the relationship between the two of them. And in turn, in those letters, she often shares little nuggets about his father, Sullivan, his siblings through that. And he, is asking questions of her, how are they? He knows that his sisters obviously are married and having children, and, he's the uncle in jail. And he's, you can get that, but unfortunately, there's just not a lot there that's been preserved. Could it still be out there? I've always held out hope that someday I'll find it. But I do think Dorr probably, maybe out of respect to his family, got rid of those letters. There's a few from Henry, I will say. There's a couple from Henry that are not too kind in 1841, basically telling his older brother that he needed to stop, that he was wrong. That's been preserved, but nothing else.
Excellent. There is a message in the chat from Nancy Austin saying that she'll be speaking on Zoom at the Providence Athenaeum on February 25th at 5:30 about a miniature called The Hours, and we'll be tying the acquisition to Dorr's mother, Lydia Allen, suggesting a new feminist perspective on Dorr's activism. There's also a question here. As a result of the Dorr Rebellion, were there any significant changes in Rhode Island's government?
Short answer to that is a long, complicated question, but yes. So there is a constitution that does emerge in the wake of Dorr's Rebellion. We frequently refer to this as the law and order kind of constitution that comes out in the wake. It goes into effect in the spring of 1843. It's drafted and processed. The Constitutional Convention takes place in the fall of 1842. And that constitution does not go as far as the People's Constitution does by any stretch of the imagination. Naturalized immigrants are still going to face severe suffrage barriers that actually aren't removed until 1884 in something called the Bourne Amendment. But it does broaden it out. There's no question about that. And African Americans are included in that constitution. So Rhode Island becomes the first state to disenfranchise African Americans and then to bring it back into the political fold in the antebellum period.
Great. It appears that Heather may have a question. Heather, if you want to unmute yourself to ask.
Hi, Eric. Thanks so much for speaking. And it's nice to see someone down from Princeton. I used to be a neighbor for many years. Please send my regards to Ben Hammond and Russell Clark for me.
Yes.
I'm up in back up in Rhode Island where I grew up, and I'm at the South County Museum. And I'm curious, you mentioned Potter, of course, and his South County connections and agriculture. Do you have any other references that I can look into so the South County Museum can look to how those in the rural working class areas really felt about this component of history?
I would point you to first Christian McBurney.
Yeah. Yep, we know.
He's done some really great work on Potter.
Mhm.
He has, you can get, Christian has his own website and you can get some of his books off of his site. But I think that would be a good place to start, and certainly to reach out to. He's very generous with his time,
Yeah.
and extremely knowledgeable, and wonderful story. And I've had a pleasure to review several of his books for the Providence Journal. But I think Christian would be the best place to start, in regards to what you're looking at there, for sure. That's what I would do, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And so are there any final chance to ask questions before we wrap up for today?
You hear me?
Yes, Ray, you have a question?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Yes, PC graduate, and I was a high school teacher, American history, and we also taught local history. And the question I have, and you said the magic word is Woonsocket. How much research have you done about Woonsocket? Because we have a legend history. Erastus Richardson, a local historian back in the 1870s, refers to the story about, you might have heard this name, Benjamin Darling, who supposedly put his hand over the firing powder on the cannon at the armory. And when they tried to light it, he put his hand first and got his hand badly burnt. So he prevented, I think, a catastrophe. That's one of the interpretations. And there are so many in Woonsocket, even Edward Harris, for example, Liberty Party, governor candidate, 1840, Cold Spring Park rally, people that, oh, by the way, when I was teaching, one more thing that might be helpful to you. The Rhode Island Committee for the Humanities, today it's the commission, back when I was teaching and we taught local history, had Trinity players go throughout the various schools in the state for free. And one of the presentations was Thomas Wilson Dorr's sister visiting him while in prison and talking what an embarrassment he had been. So I would recommend that you might contact them. They might still have, these were live performances, and there were question and answer after, where the characters stayed in character. It was fascinating. Kids thought that was wonderful because they could ask these real actors questions. And of course, our mills in Woonsocket, the Burnin Mill, one of them was owned by Sullivan Dorr. So you don't have to go too far. I just wanted to bring that up because when you talk about the Dorr Rebellion, even Christopher's restaurant today was built over the building they tore down called a Holders Block, where the Woonsocket Guard were waiting an attack from Gloucester, Burrillville with the Dorrites. It never materialized, and they scampered away after they found out that it was all over. And I'm sorry I cut in, but I just couldn't help it. Nice job, beautiful job, well done, and congratulations. Sorry, people at the museum, I didn't want to cut in. I'm sorry. I am.
Well, thank you, Ray. No, I certainly when Woonsocket's, I talk a lot about Woonsocket in the book for sure, and certainly the militia forces that were formed, in Woonsocket that absolutely came to, in April and May, very much present. There's a strong presence in Woonsocket during Dorr's inaugural parade on May 3rd, 1842, without question, a stronghold, of Dorrite support, and certainly the manufacturing center of Woonsocket. Once again, the laborers, the mechanics were the ones who stood absolutely to gain from that. And, I think Woonsocket was an absolute stronghold for Dorr. As to the question of the canon, I think as you get into reading about the Dorr Rebellion, it's a lot of it, especially later accounts, a lot of myth and memory. I think it's, I often equate it to in some ways of, how many people claim that they were responsible for preventing those cannons from going off is similar to those that said they voted for John F. Kennedy, in the wake of his death, right? I mean, everyone said that they voted for Kennedy in 1960, but we know that that obviously was not the case. It was a razor-thin election in 1960 of Kennedy over Nixon. But polls that were taken in the wake of Kennedy's assassination said something like 65% of the American public had voted for Kennedy in 1960, which obviously could not be remotely close to being true. But I think everyone wanted to claim that they themselves were responsible for saving lives, on May 18th, 1842. Probably never get to the bottom of what transpired. You can find, a multitude of accounts of what happened. Thankfully, end of the day, the most important thing is
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. When legend is a better story than, kind of unidentifiable real history, I'll take legend.
Print the legend, absolutely.
So we do have one.
I voted for Kennedy. My first national election.
We do have one final question in the chat, which is well timed, which is how do we get a copy of your book? So I'm going to place in the chat a link to the publisher as well as the code if you want to say a bit about that.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so once again, it was an honor to be asked by the Historical Society to come here today. So the publisher agreed to offer a discount code of 30%, which would very much beat any price that Amazon is currently. Prices seem to change every day on Amazon, but it will beat the Amazon price by a lot, no question about that. You have to use that code. They came up with CHAP 30. So when you call, you just give them that code. They will automatically take 30% off of the book. And a lot of the images in the book, including parts of the back cover, come from the Rhode Island Historical Society. So once again, a public thank you from me to the Historical Society, for the great help, for Phoebe Bean and for JDK could not have done. That book would not have been a reality without their assistance over many years, I will say. I actually first met Phoebe when I was an undergraduate at Providence College. So a special thank you again from me to them for that. And once again, the publisher will beat the price on Amazon for you. You just have to give them that code that Sarah put into the chat room.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Erik. I'm going to turn things back to Anne. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Erik. This was most interesting. And I'd like to invite you to join us again in 2 weeks on February 7th for filmmaker Christian De Resendes, who's going to be presenting a new segment of this documentary film, Slatersville, America's First Village. It should be another great segment. We've presented 2 so far during our virtual talks, and this is the next one. So hope to see you all in 2 weeks, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.